Join me as I dare to tell the scariest Halloween story ever told. Can I make it through without getting too creeped out? It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind that made you want to snuggle up with a warm cup of apple cider and a good book. But for 5 friends, Mike, Emily, Chris, Sarah, and Matt, it was going to be a night they would never forget. They had all gathered at the old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a place rumored to be haunted by the restless spirits of its former occupants. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling facade, and the trees creaked and swayed in the wind like skeletal fingers. As they settled in for a night of ghost stories and thrill-seeking, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just little things, a door creaking shut on its own, a faint whisper in the wind. But as the night wore on, the occurrences grew more frequent and more intense. Emily swore she saw a shadowy figure darting around the corner of her eye, while Chris swore he heard the sound of children laughing and playing in the empty halls above them. Sarah tried to brush it off as mere paranoia, but as she went to grab another beer from the fridge, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and saw a figure standing right behind her. Matt, ever the skeptic, was convinced it was just a trick of the light, but as he turned to leave the room, he felt an icy breeze sweep past him, sending shivers down his spine. As the night wore on, the strange events escalated until it seemed as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling before their eyes. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved of their own accord, and disembodied voices whispered cruel taunts in their ears. It was as though the house itself was alive, and it was determined to torment them until they fled in terror. It was then that they stumbled upon the hidden room, a secret space deep in the heart of the mansion, hidden behind a tattered tapestry. Inside, they found a series of ancient artifacts, relics of a dark and malevolent force that had been awakened by their presence. As they gazed upon the artifacts, they felt a creeping sense of dread, as though they were being slowly consumed by an unseen horror. In that instant, everything changed. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, and the air grew thick with an unholy presence. It was as though they had stumbled into a realm beyond their own, realm where the living were not welcome. Chris tried to flee, but the doors were sealed shut, trapping them inside. Emily screamed as a dark figure loomed over her, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly fury. As the horror closed in around them, Mike realized that they had stumbled into something much darker than they could have ever imagined. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a doorway to a realm of unspeakable terror, a realm that threatened to consume them whole. And as the darkness closed in, they knew that they would never be the same again. In the aftermath of the horror, the friends stumbled out into the bright morning sunlight, their faces pale and drawn. They spoke little of what had happened that night, but the look in their eyes told a story of its own. They were forever changed, haunted by the memories of what they had seen and experienced. As the days went by, strange things began to happen to each of them. Emily would find mysterious symbols etched into the walls of her bedroom, while Chris would hear whispers in the dead of night. Matt would experience vivid nightmares, and Sarah would find strange objects moving on their own. And Mike? He would see the dark figure, lurking in the shadows, its eyes burning with an unholy fury. Years later, the legend of that fateful night would spread, a cautionary tale of the horrors that lurked in the darkest recesses of the human heart. But for those who had lived through it, the terror would never truly end. They would carry it with them always, a reminder of the horrors that lay just beyond the edge of reality. Thanks for watching, and if you're feeling brave, share your own scary Halloween story in the comments below. And if you're looking for more spine-tingling tales, be sure to check out my next video, where I'll be diving into even more horror stories that will leave you sleeping with the lights on. Part 1. Arrival at the Haunted Mansion. It was a crisp autumn evening, with leaves swirling through the air in shades of amber and gold. The kind of night that whispers promises of cozy blankets and hot cider. Except that wasn't the plan. Mike, Emily, Chris, Sarah, and Matt had something else in mind. Exploring the old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. This house wasn't just a relic of time. It carried an ominous reputation. It was said to be home to the tormented souls of its original occupants. No one knew for sure what had happened there, but the stories spoke of betrayal, jealousy, and revenge. The last owner, Old Man Hadley, was rumored to have gone mad before disappearing into thin air. Since then, the place had been abandoned, left to rot and fester under the weight of its dark history. Naturally, that made it the perfect setting for a night of thrills and ghost stories. The full moon loomed high above, casting an eerie glow across the deteriorating facade of the house. Its once grand windows were now fogged over with years of grime, like cataract-clouded eyes watching their approach. The trees surrounding the property creaked and groaned in the wind, branches clawing at the sky as if begging to be released from their roots. "Man, this place is a dump," Mike muttered as they crossed the overgrown garden leading to the front porch. "You were expecting five-star luxury?" Emily teased, nudging him with her elbow. Her auburn hair flickered in the moonlight, giving her an ethereal appearance. "Keep it down, you two," Chris whispered sharply. He scanned the area nervously. "We don't want any neighbors calling the cops." Matt rolled his eyes. "Relax, Chris." His hands jammed into his jacket pockets. He was doing his best to keep his usual skepticism intact. Nobody's lived out here for decades. And even if there were cops around, they wouldn't bother with a bunch of kids telling ghost stories. Sarah trailed behind the group, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," she whispered, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I told you guys this place gives me the creeps." Mike smirked, slinging an arm over her shoulder. "Come on, Sarah. It's just a house. What's the worst that could happen?" At that moment, as if summoned by his bravado, the wind slammed the front gate shut behind them with a deafening clang. Everyone jumped. "Coincidence," Matt said, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. They climbed the creaking steps to the front porch, each step sinking slightly under their weight. When they reached the heavy oak door, it stood slightly ajar, as though expecting them. Chris hesitated before pushing it open, his flashlight beam slicing into the darkness beyond. "Ready or not," he murmured, stepping inside. The others followed, their footsteps echoing through the grand, empty foyer. The inside of the house was as decayed and decrepit as the exterior had promised. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the corners like delicate curtains. The air smelled of mildew and neglect, with an undercurrent of something more metallic, something unsettling. "Jesus," Emily whispered. "It's like the place is waiting for us." "Don't start," Sarah said sharply. "I'm already freaking out enough without you making it worse." "Hey, look at this," Mike called, holding up an old photograph frame he found on the mantel. The black and white photo inside showed a man and woman standing stiffly beside a young child, their faces blurred as if time had deliberately erased their features. "Is it just me, or does this picture feel wrong?" Emily whispered, leaning in to get a closer look. Before anyone could answer, the front door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous bang, the sound reverberating through the house. Sarah let out a yelp, and Chris whirled around, shining his flashlight on the door. "The wind," Chris muttered, though his hand shook slightly. "It's just the wind." "Yeah," Mike agreed, though his voice had lost its usual cocky edge. "Let's just keep moving." They made their way further into the mansion, their flashlights casting flickering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. At first, everything was as expected. Old, creepy, but empty. A rat scurried across the floorboards, and the occasional floorboard groaned beneath their weight. But the deeper they ventured, the more the house seemed to come alive. It started with small things. The heavy chandelier hanging above the foyer swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The grandfather clock in the corner began to tick, despite the fact that its hands hadn't moved in decades. Sarah swore she saw a figure dart around the corner, just out of the beam of her flashlight. "Did you see that?" she whispered urgently, clutching Chris's arm. "See what?" I don't know. I thought," she shook her head. "Never mind." They pressed on, drawn deeper into the heart of the house by an inexplicable pull. The walls felt closer than before, as if the mansion itself was leaning in, trapping them within its crumbling embrace. When they reached the main staircase, Chris paused, shining his flashlight up the steps. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They all fell silent. Then, faintly, almost too faint to believe, it came. The sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere above them. High-pitched, distant, and completely wrong. Okay, no, Sarah said, backing away from the staircase. We're leaving. Right now. Come on, Matt scoffed, though his voice cracked slightly. It's probably just the wind, or something. Wind doesn't sound like kids laughing, Matt, Emily snapped, her earlier humor gone. Chris took a step back from the stairs. Let's check downstairs first, just to be safe. They turned away from the staircase and continued exploring the ground floor. They passed through the dining room, where a long table sat perfectly set for a meal that had never been served. Dust-covered plates, tarnished silverware, and wine glasses stood waiting, as if the guests had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. In the adjacent sitting room, Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Guys, the mirror, she whispered, pointing at the dusty antique mirror hanging on the wall. Emily turned toward it and gasped. In the reflection, there was someone else. A dark figure loomed behind Sarah, barely visible in the cloudy glass, its eyes glinting with malice. Don't move, Chris whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Don't turn around. Sarah's breath hitched, but she stayed perfectly still. Matt, Chris whispered, shine your light behind her. Slowly. Matt nodded, raising his flashlight with a trembling hand. The beam swept across the room and revealed nothing. There was no one standing behind Sarah. The room was empty, save for the 5 of them. But when they looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. And it was smiling. Part 2. The house comes alive. For a moment, no one moved. The smile in the mirror stretched unnaturally wide, as if the figure knew a secret none of them could escape. Its dark eyes gleamed with a malevolent glee, fixed on Sarah. She stared at the reflection, her breath shallow, as if a single exhale would bring it closer. Get away from the mirror, Chris whispered. No shit, Sarah hissed, stumbling backward, away from the glass. The instant she moved, the figure vanished. The reflection showed only the group, pale and frightened, standing in the decaying sitting room. What the hell was that? Emily whispered, gripping Matt's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Matt forced a grin, but it faltered. Mirrors play tricks. Old ones, especially. It's probably nothing. It smiled at me, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It looked right at me and smiled. That wasn't a trick. A chill settled over the group. For the first time that night, even Mike seemed scared. His cocky grin was long gone, replaced by unease. Maybe we should go, Emily suggested, glancing nervously toward the front door. I second that, Sarah muttered, already moving toward the exit. Chris pulled her back. Wait, we came all this way. Let's at least see what's upstairs. We didn't come here to run away at the first creepy thing. Sarah whirled on him. Chris, we just saw a smiling shadow person in a mirror. What else do you need to call it a night? Guys, Matt said quietly, listen. They stopped arguing, and in the sudden silence, the sound became clearer, a soft whispering, drifting down from the upper floors. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakably there. The words were indistinct, little more than the hiss of breath on air, but they carried a weight that pressed against their chests, making it harder to breathe. We have to leave, Sarah insisted, but the house had other plans. As Emily reached for the doorknob, it twisted on its own. The door creaked open just enough to show the hallway beyond. But what lay beyond the threshold was no longer the garden they had entered through. The front yard was gone, replaced by a swirling void of blackness, endless and hungry. Shapes shifted inside the darkness, faint outlines of figures with glowing eyes, watching. One of them raised a hand, long fingers curling, and beckoned. Emily gasped, yanking her hand away from the door. The door slammed shut, locking them inside with a loud click. Jesus Christ! Mike shouted, pounding on the door. It won't open. He threw his weight against it again and again, but it didn't budge. They were trapped. Okay, don't panic, Chris said, though his voice betrayed his own growing fear. There's gotta be another way out. Yeah? Like where? Emily asked bitterly. Upstairs, Matt whispered. Maybe there's a window. Everyone turned toward the staircase. It loomed in the center of the house, the steps curling upward into the dark like the spine of a beast. The whispering sounds grew louder the longer they stared, as if whatever waited above was eager for them to come closer. We shouldn't go up there, Sarah whispered. Her voice cracked with fear. We don't have a choice, Chris replied. With no other options, they moved toward the staircase, one hesitant step at a time. Each step creaked loudly beneath their weight, as if the house were groaning in protest or anticipation. The second floor was darker than the first, shrouded in thick shadows that danced along the walls. Their flashlights flickered, beams wavering like they were struggling to stay on. Keep moving, Chris whispered, though it was clear even he wasn't as confident as he pretended to be. They wandered down a long hallway, doors lining either side. Most were tightly shut, their doorknobs cold and rusted. But one door, halfway down the hall, stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The whispering grew louder, clearer. Come closer, come see, just a little more. The voice was soft, beckoning, and filled with venomous sweetness. It called to each of them, promising safety if they would only step into the room. I think we should open it, Mike muttered, already moving toward the door despite Sarah's whispered protests. Mike, don't, Emily started, but he had already pushed the door open. The room beyond was bathed in a pale, flickering light. In the center of the room stood a child's rocking chair, swaying gently on its own. The walls were covered in hand-drawn symbols, crude spirals and jagged lines that pulsed faintly with every sway of the chair. But that wasn't the worst part. On the far wall, something was written in thick, red letters. The words dripped slowly, as if the message had only just been scrawled. You found me. The chair rocked harder, faster, as if delighted by their arrival. The whispering rose to a fevered pitch, words twisting and overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside. No, Sarah screamed, throwing herself at the door and pounding on it. Let us out. Let us out. Matt spun in a circle, his flashlight flickering wildly as he tried to make sense of the room. There's no one here. Where is the whispering coming from? The answer came too late. The rocking chair stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room, crushing in its weight. Then, slowly, the chair began to turn. Mike backed away as the chair rotated on its own, revealing a small, lifeless doll sitting in its seat. The doll was grotesque, with stitched-together features. Button eyes too large for its tiny face, a jagged grin carved into fabric lips, and matted hair twisted into clumps. But the most horrifying detail was the thick cord around its neck, knotted tight as if to mimic a hanging. What the hell is that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispering stopped, replaced by an ominous ticking, like a clock counting down from somewhere deep within the walls. Get away from it, Mike, Chris warned. But Mike stood frozen, staring at the doll as if caught in a trance. Then the doll's head snapped toward him. Holy! Mike stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and crashing into Emily. They fell to the floor in a heap just as the rocking chair gave a loud, final creak and tipped forward, spilling the doll onto the floor. The door flung open, as if the house were expelling them, forcing them to leave. Go, 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 Matt shouted, hauling Sarah to her feet. They scrambled out of the room and back into the hallway, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere chasing them like an invisible force. The house began to shift around them. Doors that were once shut now slammed open, walls seemed to pulse and groan, and the once distant children's laughter returned, this time much closer. What's happening? Sarah cried, running at full speed. The house, Chris panted. It's trying to keep us in. As they reached the staircase, the floor beneath them buckled, throwing Matt against the railing. The wood splintered beneath his weight, and he teetered dangerously over the edge. Matt! Emily screamed, reaching for him. Matt's hands slipped, and for one terrifying moment, he hung suspended over the drop, feet kicking wildly for purchase. Just as his grip gave out, Mike grabbed his wrist and hauled him back over the railing. "Thanks," Matt gasped, clutching his chest. But there was no time for gratitude. The house wasn't done with them yet. The group raced down the stairs, their footsteps echoing strangely, as if the sound looped back at them from every corner of the house. They reached the foyer, only to find the front door still locked tight. "Break a window," Chris shouted, running toward the nearest one. But when he swung his flashlight toward the glass, the windows showed only blackness, an endless void. No street, no trees, no sky. Just nothing. "There's no way out," Sarah whimpered, backing into a corner. "There has to be," Mike shouted, slamming his shoulder against the door in desperation. It didn't so much as budge. And then they heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. "Oh no," Emily whispered, backing away from the staircase. "Something's coming." Chris shone his flashlight up the steps, but it flickered weakly, barely illuminating the top landing. A dark shape stood there, motionless, just out of sight. They couldn't make out its features, only that it was waiting, watching. And then it began to descend, one step at a time. The stairs groaned beneath its weight, each step louder than the last. "We need to hide," Matt hissed. "Now." They scattered, sprinting in different directions, each driven by pure instinct. Chris and Sarah dove behind the staircase, while Emily and Mike tore through the dining room. Matt, alone, ran toward the kitchen, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The footsteps continued, slow and methodical, following their movements. It was hunting them. Matt skidded into the kitchen, his heart hammering in his chest. He pressed himself against the refrigerator, trying to quiet his breathing. From the next room, he could hear the faint shuffle of feet. Something was circling. The kitchen was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator motor. And then, the whispering started again. But this time, it came from inside the fridge. Matt stared at it, his stomach twisting in fear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the refrigerator door began to creak open on its own. "No, no, no," Matt whispered, backing away. The door swung wide, revealing nothing, just empty shelves. Yet the whispering persisted, filling the room with promises of secrets best left unknown. Suddenly, something icy clamped around his wrist. Matt screamed, jerking his arm back, but invisible fingers held tight, dragging him closer to the gaping refrigerator door. The cold seeped into his skin, spreading like poison through his veins. He fought desperately, but the grip was relentless, pulling him toward the darkness waiting inside the fridge. And then, just as suddenly, the hand let go. Matt stumbled backward, gasping for breath, as the refrigerator slammed shut with a deafening bang. Meanwhile, Mike and Emily crouched behind the long dining table, their backs pressed against the wall. "Did you see it?" Emily whispered. Mike shook his head. "We can't stay here." Just as they prepared to make a break for it, the chandelier above them rattled violently, the crystals jingling like wind chimes in a storm. Mike glanced up and froze. A figure crouched on the ceiling, twisted limbs clinging to the plaster like a grotesque spider. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, locked directly onto Mike. Emily saw it too and let out a stifled scream. "Run!" Mike shouted, yanking her to her feet. They bolted from the room, the thing on the ceiling skittering after them with inhuman speed. Back in the foyer, Chris and Sarah clung to each other behind the staircase, listening as the footsteps closed in. "We're not going to make it," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we are," Chris whispered fiercely, though even he didn't believe it. Suddenly, the grandfather clock in the corner began to chime. Once, twice, 3 times. With each toll, the house seemed to shudder, as if the sound were shaking it to its foundations. And then, without warning, every door in the house flew open at once. The clock struck midnight, and the true nightmare began. Part 3. The Midnight Hour. The grandfather clock's final chime echoed through the house, a death knell that sent a ripple through the air. Every door in the mansion flung wide open, banging against the walls as if the house itself had come alive. The air hummed with an energy that made their skin crawl, an unseen force building to something worse than any of them could imagine. Chris and Sarah clutched each other behind the staircase, their hearts pounding in sync with the fading chimes. The air felt thick, too thick, and breathing became a struggle. "Chris," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to move." But Chris could barely hear her over the rising roar of whispers. It wasn't just one voice now. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping in a chaotic, maddening crescendo. The words were unintelligible, but the malice in them was clear. Whatever was in this house didn't want them to leave. It wanted them to suffer. Chris nodded, tugging her arm. "Let's go," he whispered back, as they crawled out from behind the staircase and bolted down the nearest hallway. Emily and Mike had run blindly, desperate to escape the skittering creature that had been crawling along the ceiling. They stumbled into what appeared to be a library, the door slamming shut behind them just as they heard the thing screeching down the hallway. "Did we lose it?" Emily panted, her eyes darting around the room. The library was enormous, bookshelves towering to the ceiling, every inch of wall space covered in dusty, forgotten tomes. A single oil lamp flickered on a table in the center, casting long, ominous shadows. "I think so," Mike replied, out of breath. He glanced up, just to be sure that whatever had been stalking them wasn't hiding overhead. The ceiling was clear, at least for now. Emily moved toward the window, tugging at the heavy curtains in a desperate hope to find a way out. But when she pulled them back, all she found was a solid brick wall. Her heart sank. "We're trapped?" "There has to be a way out," Mike said, searching the room. But before he could look further, something strange caught his eye. A single book on the shelf, glowing faintly. Its spine was cracked, the title long faded, but the glow seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. It was calling to him. "Mike, what are you doing?" Emily hissed, but he was already reaching for it. As soon as his fingers brushed the cover, the whispers intensified, filling the room with a suffocating energy. The lamp flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed. Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way. The wooden boards splintered like brittle bones, and they were plunged into darkness. Chris and Sarah had made their way down the hallway, but it felt like the house was stretching, elongating into an endless maze. Each door they passed opened to reveal nightmarish scenes. Decaying corpses, children crying in corners, rooms full of rusted knives and blood-stained walls. The house was no longer pretending. It was feeding them its darkest secrets, hoping to break them piece by piece. "I can't," Sarah whimpered, her hand shaking as she gripped Chris's arm. "I can't keep going." "Yes, you can." Chris's voice was strained, his own fear gnawing at him, but he couldn't stop now. "We'll find the others and get the hell out of here. Together." They stumbled into the next room, slamming the door behind them. It was a bedroom, old, decrepit, the bed rotting away under tattered sheets. A massive mirror hung on the wall opposite them, streaked with dirt and grime. But the reflection in the mirror was wrong. The room in the reflection was perfect, untouched by time or decay. And standing in front of the bed in the reflection was a woman in a black dress, her face obscured by a veil. Sarah gasped, backing away. Who is that?" The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching them. And then, without warning, her head jerked toward the door. Chris's blood ran cold. "We need to get out of here now." But before they could move, the door began to rattle violently. The knob turned back and forth, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. "Chris," Sarah whimpered, tears welling in her eyes. Chris grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, just as the door exploded inward, a gust of icy air flooding the room. They both screamed, backing toward the mirror. The woman in the reflection didn't move, but her veil began to lift. Slowly, inch by inch, revealing something unspeakable underneath. Chris couldn't look away, his eyes glued to the figure as she stood there, her pale, rotting face emerging from behind the veil. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Run." The whisper wasn't in his head. It came from the woman, though her lips never moved. Chris, please. Sarah pulled at him, but he was frozen in place. The woman in the mirror raised her hand, pointing at Chris, and the glass began to crack. Thin lines spider-webbed across the surface, the cracks growing wider and deeper. Chris. Sarah's voice was desperate, on the verge of hysterics. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying through the room like jagged teeth. Chris snapped out of his trance, pulling Sarah toward the door. But when they opened it, they weren't in the hallway anymore. Mike and Emily landed hard on a cold, stone floor, the air knocked from their lungs. They groaned, struggling to sit up, but the room they had fallen into was unlike anything they had seen in the house so far. The walls were made of rough stone, slick with moisture, and the ceiling was low and oppressive. Ancient symbols were carved into the floor, radiating out from the center of the room where a large, stone altar stood. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering with an unnatural light. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Mike didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the altar. Something about it called to him, just like the book had. There was something here, something powerful and dangerous, and it was waiting for them. As they moved closer, they noticed something lying on the altar, a set of keys, old and rusted. They gleamed faintly in the candlelight. "Do you think?" Mike began, but his words trailed off as the air grew colder, the shadows in the room lengthening. From the far corner, they heard a low, guttural growl. Emily grabbed Mike's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could turn to flee, the growl grew louder, and the shadows began to shift. Something huge and formless rose from the darkness, its body writhing and pulsating with unnatural energy. They backed away, but it was too late. The creature lunged toward them, its form twisting and reshaping, tendrils of shadow reaching out to ensnare them. Emily screamed as the darkness engulfed her, pulling her into the void. Chris and Sarah had burst through the door, only to find themselves in the basement. The air was damp and musty, and the sound of dripping water echoed around them. How did we get down here?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Chris didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something in the corner of the room, a trapdoor, partially obscured by debris. It was old and rotting, but the lock on it was new, too new. "It looks like—" Chris's voice trailed off. He didn't want to finish the thought, but Sarah did. "It looks like someone's been using it recently." They didn't have time to think about what that meant, because above them, they heard the footsteps again, the heavy, deliberate steps of something coming for them. With no other choice, Chris rushed toward the trapdoor, pulling at the lock. It wouldn't budge. "Help me!" he shouted, and Sarah ran over, using all her strength to help him pry it open. Finally, with a loud snap, the lock broke, and the trapdoor swung open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel descending into the earth. They hesitated for only a moment before plunging into the darkness. Part 4. The depths below. The tunnel was cold, damp, and reeked of earth and decay. As Chris and Sarah descended, their flashlights flickered, the batteries struggling to hold on. Their footsteps echoed against the stone walls, swallowed almost instantly by the darkness. The deeper they went, the stranger it felt, as though the air grew thicker with every step, charged with unseen energy. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Chris shook his head, shining his flickering beam further down the passage. "I don't know, but we have to keep going. Whatever's upstairs, it's not going to stop." They climbed deeper, the wooden steps creaking underfoot. As they reached the bottom of the tunnel, the narrow passage opened into a vast underground chamber. At its center stood a large circular pit, ringed by ancient carvings that seemed to pulse with a dull red glow. The carvings weren't just symbols, they were faces, twisted in anguish, mouths open in silent screams. "What the hell is this?" Sarah asked, horrified. Chris ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. It felt like the pit was calling to them, drawing them closer. The air buzzed with an electric hum, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close in, as if the house had followed them underground. "Let's not find out." Chris grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to get back up, find the others." Just as they turned to leave, something shifted in the pit. A low, guttural moan echoed through the chamber, sending a wave of cold air rushing over them. Then, a hand, pale, gaunt, and covered in dirt, reached out from the darkness of the pit, gripping the edge with long, bony fingers. Sarah let out a strangled cry. "Chris, there's someone in there." Another hand emerged, followed by a head, twisted unnaturally to the side, with eyes as black as voids, leaking dark fluid that dripped into the dirt. The thing that crawled from the pit didn't look entirely human. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched thin over jagged bones. As it pulled itself over the edge, it smiled, a wide, too wide grin, revealing cracked teeth. "Run!" Chris shouted, yanking Sarah toward the tunnel entrance. The thing crawled after them, its body bending and snapping in unnatural ways, like a puppet with its strings tangled. It moved faster than it should have, clawing across the ground with a hungry growl. Chris and Sarah sprinted back up the narrow staircase, the thing dragging itself after them, its ragged breaths growing louder. They scrambled toward the top of the trapdoor, hearts pounding, legs burning. But something slammed the door shut from above. "No!" Chris yelled, pounding on the wood. Sarah screamed as the creature's clawed hand brushed against her ankle, its cold touch like death itself. In a desperate move, Chris grabbed an iron bar from the side of the wall and jabbed it at the thing's hand, causing it to let out an inhuman screech. They threw their weight against the trapdoor, forcing it open, and climbed out just as the creature lunged again, missing them by inches. The door slammed shut behind them. They lay gasping for breath on the basement floor, the house silent except for the faint hum of something stirring within the walls. "That thing," Sarah whispered between ragged breaths. "What was that?" Chris shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know, and I don't want to find out." They staggered to their feet, the flashlight beams shaking in their trembling hands. The house was watching them now. They could feel it. The walls pulsed like the lungs of a sleeping beast, and the floor beneath them shifted subtly, like it was alive. "We need to find the others," Chris said, helping Sarah to her feet. "And we need to do it fast." Meanwhile, Mike and Emily found themselves deeper within the house's twisted belly. After falling through the floor of the library, they had landed in a hallway that shouldn't exist. It stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls covered in rotting, peeling wallpaper, with strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. The floor was uneven, broken planks revealing a bottomless void beneath their feet. "This doesn't make any sense," Emily whispered, glancing around wildly. "We should have hit the basement by now." "This place, it doesn't follow the rules," Mike muttered. He felt it too, the way space bent and folded on itself within the house, as if it were alive and hungry. A door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar. From the other side, they could hear soft crying. A child's sobs, pitiful and broken. Emily froze. "Do you hear that?" Mike nodded, gripping her hand tighter. "We shouldn't go toward it. It's not real. Whatever it is, it's trying to trick us." But Emily's feet moved on their own. "What if it's someone trapped? What if—" "No." Mike's voice was firm. "We need to stay together. This house wants us to split up." The crying grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. And then, from the dark corners of the hallway, shadows began to shift and move. Figures emerged, tall, thin, and eyeless, their bodies flickering in and out of existence like images from a broken film reel. They began to crawl toward them, limbs bending and twisting in unnatural ways. "Run!" Mike shouted, pulling Emily toward the open door. They burst through the doorway and slammed it shut behind them, cutting off the advancing figures. Inside the room, they found something even worse, a shrine. At the center of the room stood an altar, identical to the one Chris and Sarah had seen below, except this one held a collection of photographs pinned to the wall. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The photographs were of them, all 5 of them, taken at different moments throughout the night, moments they hadn't realized were being watched. A photo of Sarah looking into the mirror. A photo of Mike pulling Emily through the dining room. A photo of Chris pounding on the trapdoor. "How?" Mike whispered, staring at the images in horror. Then, from behind the altar, something shifted, a figure rising slowly to its feet. It was the man from the old photograph they had found earlier in the house. His eyes were black pits, and his mouth curled into a smile far too wide to be human. "You were always going to end up here," the figure whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "The house called you. It has been waiting." In the basement, Chris and Sarah found the front door, finally. But the wood was warped, and the doorknob burned cold against their skin, as if warning them that leaving would come at a price. "Should we try?" Sarah whispered, fear in her eyes. Before Chris could answer, a voice whispered from behind them, "You can't leave. Not yet." They spun around to see the shadowed figure from the staircase standing at the edge of the room. It smiled, and the house groaned, its walls closing in tighter. And from above, the clock began to chime again. Part 5. No escape. The clock's chime rang through the house, louder than before, each strike rattling their bones, as if the sound carried some ancient power. Chris and Sarah backed toward the warped front door, trapped between it and the shadowed figure, which now advanced on them with a slow, deliberate pace. The house shifted around them, the walls breathing, groaning like a beast awakening from slumber. "Chris, we need to run." Sarah's voice cracked, pure panic in every syllable. But the shadow was faster. Before they could react, it lunged, stretching impossibly long, its limbs bending in unnatural ways as it reached for them. Chris grabbed Sarah's hand and yanked her toward the door. They slammed against it, forcing the wood to splinter beneath their weight. "Go!" Chris roared, throwing his shoulder into the door again. It cracked, but not enough. Behind them, the figure loomed closer, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. "You were meant to stay," it whispered, the words slipping into their minds like oil. With one final shove, the door gave way, splintering into jagged pieces, and Chris and Sarah tumbled out, only to land in another part of the house. They gasped in horror. This isn't outside," Sarah stammered, staring at their surroundings. They were back in the same hallway they had fled earlier, the one that seemed to stretch endlessly. But something was different this time. The walls now dripped with dark fluid, and the air carried a low hum, like the house was vibrating with anticipation. "No, no, no, no," Chris shouted, slamming his fists against the walls. "We should have been outside. We broke the door." Sarah grabbed his arm, trying to keep him calm, though her own fear was mounting. "Chris, it's not going to let us leave." Meanwhile, elsewhere in the house, Emily and Mike stood frozen before the man from the photograph, his black eyes gleaming with delight as he studied them. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly their breath puffed out in clouds. "What do you want from us?" Emily whispered, her voice small. The man tilted his head slowly, as though considering her question. Then, with a smile too wide to belong to anything human, he whispered, "You." The words slithered through the air, heavy with intent, and before they could react, the shadows in the room began to move. They slithered toward them like serpents, wrapping around their legs and arms, pulling them toward the altar. "Mike!" Emily screamed, struggling against the unseen force. Mike fought with everything he had, grabbing her hand, pulling against the shadows that dragged them closer to the altar. But the more they struggled, the stronger the force became. It was like the house itself was feeding on their fear. And then, from the altar, the man whispered, "The house wants all of you." The photographs on the wall twitched, as if coming alive, the faces in them shifting and twisting in agony. Mike stared, horrified, as their own reflections in the photos began to move, mimicking their panic, their fear. "No," Emily gasped. "This can't be real." The shadows tightened their grip, pulling them closer to the altar. Chris and Sarah ran blindly through the twisting corridors, the sound of footsteps chasing them from every direction. No matter which way they turned, the hallway seemed to bend and curve back onto itself, trapping them in a nightmare loop. "We can't outrun it," Sarah cried. "We have to try." Chris shouted back, though he was beginning to realize the truth. The house wasn't just a building. It was alive, and it wanted them. Just as they rounded a corner, they saw something up ahead, a faint flickering light. "Emily! Mike!" Chris shouted, sprinting toward the light. But when they reached the source, it wasn't their friends.